Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced, and this will be sort of my last video of 2020. Well, this will be the beginning of a series that I'm going to start here at the end of 2023 into early 2024. Every year I like to redo sort of my introduction to React videos because, every year I'm wiser and I understand these things a little bit more. And I think a better way is to sort of just kind of convey what you need to know to kind of get your fingers dirty, I guess. So, so we're going to start off by introducing React. So this is going to be my 2024 Intro to React playlist. And let's begin talking about it. So first we're going to talk about conceptually what React is. Okay, so React is a front-end framework. Okay, so in the sense that let's talk about just sort of normal applications. So you might have a server application. Okay, and this could be something, speaking from a JavaScript point of view, this could be something like Express, okay, using Node. And essentially this is going to kind of run, it's basically a computer that you can have control over that is allowed to accept requests and whatnot. Okay, but then you're going to have client-side applications. That's your HTML, CSS, your front-end JavaScript that you might be using jQuery. Okay, and this is essentially what React is trying to, where the React plays. So essentially what would happen is that I would go to google.com, it would request from Google servers a website, and that website, that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript would be run in my browser and render a website. And then that client would talk to the server to get information that it needs and, provide me the user experience that I'm used to. But when you write HTML, it can be very hammer and chisel, right? Like, for example, in HTML, you have what's called the DOM tree or the HTML tree, and you would have an HTML node at the top. Okay, so let's just change the color of these things. Okay. There we go. We'd have like an HTML node at the top, and then you would have like your head. Okay, and again, if you're watching this video series, it is assumed that you have some knowledge of HTML, CSS, and JS. If you do not, I recommend you watch my video playlist on those first. Because honestly, to be good at React, it does require a foundation in HTML, CSS, and JS. Too many people try to rush to learn React and find it that they don't learn it well, and they find it overly hard, and they never really get that good with it because they don't have that foundation to really appreciate what it is doing. So you really do want to make sure first you kind of know this before we get into what React's going to do. But still, feel free to stick around. Okay, so again, you start from the HTML. In an HTML document, you would have your head and your body. And then your body, you might have several sections of your website. So you might have like your header. And you might have your main tag with your main content of your body. Okay, and again, just to kind of see the hierarchy here. And this would be referred to as your DOM tree, and it would basically be the relationship between all this HTML. So imagine that you have a bunch of HTML like this. Let's say it's like you have a form tag that's in your main. Okay. And that form tag has several inputs in it. Okay, and then you have all these inputs in there, and they're all connected. So you see, like, this is how the HTML DOM tree works, the document object model. Now imagine that we could just take this group of inputs, because maybe I use this exact same form multiple times across my website. So right now, in just plain HTML, CSS, I'm writing that form tag and those input tags over and over again. But what if I could encapsulate them in something called a form component? Okay, which essentially captures all of that. So let me actually just get that text to the top. Okay. And now going forward, anytime I need to use this form component, I can literally just use this again. And instead of me having to write all that HTML over again, I can just put down this component. Okay, so now I can use that form multiple times, and I'm not writing out all that HTML hammer and chisel because I have these little building blocks that I can create. Okay, so this is what React really is going to offer us. It's going to offer us the ability to take sort of chunks of HTML and put them in a wrapper called a component, which are basically building blocks that we can then use to much more quickly assemble our HTML. Okay, and the cool thing is we can reuse them. So once I built it, I can reuse it, and I can use that same building block over and over and over again. Okay, and this essentially makes building websites much easier because I can imagine you're on the team of Facebook, because Facebook is who created React. Okay, how often are they going to need that like button? Should every place where that like button gets used have to recreate the same HTML with the same icon, the same logic, the same API calls? No, they can make just that like button a single component, and then anyone who's making somewhere on the React website that's going to use that like button, they can just literally just take that component and plop, put it in there like a building block. Okay, so that is sort of what React does for it, and that's what all these kind of client-side front-end frameworks do for us. So that includes React, Angular, Vue, Svelte, Solid.js, and Quick, and probably a few more. Okay, but essentially that is what they're doing. So they're saying, hey, we're going to make this part easier for you. So instead of you having to write all that HTML, CSS, and jQuery, hammer and chisel, what you're going to do is instead you're going to be able to create reusable blocks where you can encapsulate your HTML, your JavaScript logic, your CSS, all your interactions. Like everything essentially becomes a block that you can just reuse over and over again. Cool. Okay, so now that we've established that, let's actually get into the coding side of this. Okay, so here we're going to go. I'm going to make a basic. We're going to do is as we go through these videos, I'm going to be working throughout each of these folders. So these first three folders in the early stages, what we're going to do is that we're going to work with sort of like raw React. Okay, I think the best way to kind of understand it is to be able to just sort of build it out, okay, from scratch. So you can see how all the pieces connect. So that way when you use a much more complex sort of build template, you'll appreciate the bells and whistles a little bit more. So let's walk through this together. Okay, and again, you can find this code by clicking the link in the video description to find this particular repo where I put all my 2024 video code into. Okay, so you can find that all in the link to the repository in the video description. Okay, so what we're going to do is follow along with me. Just have an empty folder opened up in your favorite coding tool. I'm using Visual Studio Code. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to close all these tabs to make this a little bit easier. Okay, and what I'm going to do, and now we'll close this terminal. I won't need this for now. I am going to create a few files. I'm going to create a index.html. So that's going to be our HTML file. We're going to create a components.js. That's going to be where we create our React components. And we're going to create a app.js. So that's going to be where we connect our React application to our HTML. And we're going to create a new file, style.css. So that way, if we want to do some CSS, we can. Okay, and you'll see this whole setup in this template folder. So again, if you look through the repository and you want to kind of refer to it for a secondary reference, it's right there in that template folder. So you can look at exactly how this is all going to be set up. And this README, it will explain the setup here. So when you're going to the repo, when you get to this section, there'll be a README so you can actually kind of read a little bit of a breakdown. But essentially what's going to happen is that we're just creating a normal run-of-the-mill HTML page. At the end of the day, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are always HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But again, we can bring in third-party libraries in the same way that we would bring in jQuery or Alpine or HTMX to help us do a lot of this work. We can bring in React. Okay, oftentimes when you work with React, you won't be doing it this way. Oftentimes a lot of that stuff is kind of hidden from you. But again, we're going to do it the long way so that way you can kind of see how all the pieces fit together. So first we're going to import the libraries we need. Okay, so if you go to the README, again, you can go to the video description. We're going to import these 3 script tags. So I'm going to copy over those 3 script tags over to my index.html. in the head tag, these are going to be our external libraries that we need. Okay, just turn that into a comment using Control/. Okay, I'm going to hit save just for it to indent that for me. Thank you. Okay, now what do we have here? This first script tag brings in React. So right now I'm using React 18. So keep that in mind. Okay, so this is going to bring in the React file. But React is really just a way of organizing component logic. It's actually agnostic to the way the browser works. So there has to be something that takes all our component logic and can convert it to turning it into like HTML nodes in the DOM. And that's what the second thing does. Okay, React DOM. Okay, because the cool thing about React is that this component logic can be converted into different targets. So there's actually something that actually will convert it into the right type of UI components for a mobile phone, and that's called React Native. So that's the cool thing about React. You can reuse what you learn in React in many different places, like mobile and web. Okay, now basically React DOM here, that's what's going to handle sort of converting our React code and making it understandable for us to render it as HTML to the DOM. Okay, it's basically taking all our components, all of our JSX, we don't know what that is yet, and it will convert it into sort of actual HTML. Okay, and then the thing is that we're going to be using the syntax that I just mentioned called JSX. JSX is going to make it where we can actually write like HTML in our JavaScript, which is going to feel really weird at first. Okay, but then it's going to become like your favorite thing. Trust me, you get addicted to it. But JavaScript doesn't actually have JSX built in. It's not a thing. It's just something that Facebook created. Okay? So there needs to be a way to take what we're writing and turning it into actual JavaScript that JavaScript engines understand. So that's the job of Babel. Babel is a transpiler. Oftentimes it's used to take newer versions of JavaScript and translate it to older versions of JavaScript to comply with like browsers that may not be able to use newer versions of JavaScript. So there is a Babel plugin that converts JSX, this special, HTML and JavaScript syntax that Facebook created, and allows it to be translated into the actual underlying functions in the React library, which don't look as pretty. Okay, so that's what these things are needed for. That's why we need these three things. Okay. Now what we need is our libraries. Like we need to now connect our JavaScript code. Okay, so we're going to connect. So let me just say, hey, our JavaScript code. Okay, so let me just comment that out. And we're going to connect our two files. So we're going to first we'll connect. You want the components file on top because the idea is you're going to want all your components understood before you use them. Okay, so we're going to want script source. Now we have to add a type property. This is going to be very important. That on there you add a property that's called text Babel. This is going to be the little signal that Babel should transpile it. Okay, that Babel, I need to read this JavaScript and see if there's anything I need to convert. Okay, which is in all the JSX we're going to write. And then we link to our file /components.js. And again, we want to add a little defer keyword because we don't want that code to be read until after the DOM loads. Okay, and then we'll just do the same thing for our app.js. Okay. And then here's going to be our app.js. For future videos, I'm not going to walk through this whole thing. I am going to just use the template that we have in that folder. And then eventually we're going to graduate to using a full-on build using the Vite template. Okay. Cool. So that's going to link the two files. Now, one thing I want to do is I'm going to want to create one single element. Okay, that's the thing you'll see in these React files. Okay, oftentimes what you see is a div with the ID of root. That's what you'll see. Okay, and that's it. It doesn't matter what it is. Just to kind of show you that it really just doesn't matter, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to do a main tag with the ID, a main tag with the ID of React. Okay. It doesn't matter. It just needs to be some sort of node for us to grab later. Okay, cool. So now if I were to open this up, so I'm going to assume that you have the live server extension for VS Code. If not, you can just click where the extensions are. So nowadays you hit the gears here and you can click on extensions to install them. But you can right click on this index.html and just open it with live server. So I'm going to do that now. Okay, so there's a document. Right now I see nothing. Okay, so let's do something. Usually what you do is your top building block. Okay, so your building block at the top of the tree. Okay, because now you're going to have, instead of having a tree of different HTML nodes, you're going to have a tree of building blocks that you create. Usually the top building block is called app. Okay, and these are called components. And all a component is, theoretically, and the simplest way to think about it for now, it's a function that returns HTML. Okay, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Okay, but we're going to peel at the layers. So basically here in our components.js, I'm going to want to write a function. We're going to call it app. And right now it's just going to return some HTML. I'm literally just going to return an H1 that says hello world. Okay, so there's my first component. Okay, again, a component is just a function that returns HTML. You'll find out later on that it's not really HTML, it's something called JSX. Okay, but it looks a lot like HTML. So these are the kind of things that Babel's converting. It's going to look at our code and say, hey, that should be turned into JavaScript, and it'll do what it does. We don't need to necessarily worry about that part. Okay, cool. So that's good, but I still don't see anything on the screen. So how does React know to take this app component and put it on the screen? Well, we have to tell it to. Okay, again, when you use templates, this part's usually done for you, and that's why React seems so magical. Well, let's actually see how this works. Well, where would we want React to show up? Where do we want React to kind of like take over our HTML and say, hey, we're going to put React right here? Well, I wanted to kind of inject in that main tag that we created right here. This main tag with an ID of React, I wanted to inject it there. So here in my app.js, I'm going to go grab the node I want to inject React in. Okay, and that's going to be that, we'll call it the node. Okay, it's the specific DOM node that I want to grab. So I'm going to say document.querySelector, get me the node that has the ID of React. Okay, and this should grab it. Okay, now what I'm going to do is we need a root to the React tree. So again, it's going to be a tree of building blocks, a tree of components. There has to be somewhere that tree starts, and that's called the root. Okay, so in React, we need to create a root that we can then attach to that node. Okay, so we're going to create the root of our component tree. Okay, and basically we'll say const root equals React DOM. And again, this is going to be case sensitive, so make sure you spell React DOM just the way I spelled it. Dot create root. Okay, and then we pass the node to that. So we're saying, hey, this node is going to be where we want the root to start. Okay, we're basically planting our seed here in this DOM node, and everything else is going to kind of take over that spot. Okay, theoretically, you could have multiple roots, but we won't go there right now. Right now, one root, we're good to go. Okay, and then we just say, hey, what do we want in that root? So then we're going to render our component tree at the root. Okay, and we say root.render. So we're going to say, hey, we want to render the following component where that node is. And then we pass it a component that we want to render. So in this case, now notice how I write this, app. And now hello world shows up. Okay, so see, hello world shows up. The reason being is that, and then again, the thing to notice, the thing to appreciate is like, notice how I'm able to write it like I'm writing HTML. That's JSX. Okay, so that's the beauty of JSX. Basically, these components, these functions that return HTML can be written like they're HTML tags. There's a couple key points though. Okay, all components have to have an uppercase name, because that is how when Babel's like transpiling and taking all of our JSX, all of this HTML like syntax and converting it, the way it's able to tell if something is a component or a normal HTML tag is the capitalization, because all HTML tags are lowercase. So then all components are uppercase. And that's how it knows, oh, it's uppercase. It's uppercase A app. So that must mean there's a function called app somewhere. So then it looks through our code for a function called app. That function should return some sort of HTML or another component, aka JSX, and then it's going to render that. So basically, when it sees this and I say, hey, render this, okay, basically React sees that this is capital A, so then looks for the function with a matching name, runs it, and then takes the HTML that that function returns and injects it into my DOM, right where I told it to. Okay, so that's essentially what React does. Okay, but usually what you're going to end up with is a whole component tree. So now instead of this whole HTML tree, you're going to have a tree of components. Okay, so you might have this HTML. So in this case, instead of an HTML component, let me make this bigger. Okay, you're going to have a component, and the top of your tree is always going to be the app component. Does it have to be? No, but that's typically how it's done. And then, you'll have like your different components that go below that. So you might have a component for, that form component that we talked about. Okay, and again, I can go then use that form component multiple times. Okay. And you end up having this component tree, this component hierarchy. But again, always remember, it starts with one component at the top, typically called your app component because it represents your entire application. And then in there, we'll start nesting other components. Okay, so essentially that's why this is the root of your tree. And we mounted this component at your root, which took over that main node or that main tag. Okay, so essentially that's what's mechanically going on. Okay, and the cool thing is I can write as many components as I want. So I can go here, write another component called function other component. Okay, and this other component, okay, can take, we'll say it returns a div, okay, that has an h1 in it, and that says hello world. Okay, so now I want to use this component. I could use it over here, but let's see what happens. Other component. Okay, now notice I'm getting an error. So see, it says JSX expressions and it kind of trails off. If I highlight over it, it'll give me the detail. Okay, so if I go over here, I should, well, instead of waiting for like little tooltip, I just kind of cut to the chase. The thing is that you can't, right there, see, JS expressions must have one parent element. So notice that this has two, there's like two at the same level. So how can I fix this? I could wrap this in a div. So I could just write a div and put the div around both of them. And then that suddenly works. Okay, and you can see there it works. We see the hello world h1 right here. And then this other component gets rendered, which means, hey, it sees the uppercase name and goes, oh, wait a second, this must be a function. So then it looks for the function called other component and sees, okay, this returns pure HTML, so I should inject that HTML over here. And then this gets replaced with that HTML. And now we see hello world, hello world. Okay, that's all it is. You're essentially creating building blocks. Each of these functions becomes a wrapper over like HTML. And you'll see later on, we can also mix some HTML, JavaScript and CSS in there too. Okay. But again, the rule is, a couple rules. Again, there has to be only one parent element. So there has to be something that wraps everything for each component, that particular component's output. That's a JSX thing. Again, this syntax is HTML-like syntax is called JSX. Component names have to be capitalized. And there's going to be other rules we'll learn as we go. But again, three takeaways. A component is a function. What makes a component what makes a function a component is that its return value is JSX or null. It could be null. Okay, so it's either JSX or null. And in that case, if that's true about that function, then we can then use that function in our JSX expressions like this, where we can write them as almost like an HTML tag. Okay, And yeah, I mean, at this point, what I would do is I would just begin playing with this. Okay, so let's just kind of do a quick example. Okay, so I am going to create a function called column. Yeah, we'll call it column, capital C. Okay, and this is going to return a div. And I'm going to give it a class. Now, here's another rule of JSX. We don't use the word class anymore. It just has to do with the way that technically the word class already is used in JavaScript. And technically, when I'm writing this HTML-like syntax, I'm not writing HTML. I'm technically writing JavaScript. All of this is getting converted into JavaScript under the hood by Babel. So in this case, they had to give it another word. So in this case, whenever I want to add a class to an HTML tag for styling purposes, I have to write class name instead. So in this case, we're going to say this one's a column. Okay, so I'm going to write a class of column. Okay, and then I'm going to write a function called row. Okay, and we're going to return a div with the class name of row. Okay, just to kind of illustrate this. So now what I'm going to do okay. Thinking. Because I don't want to get into something too advanced, but I'm going to show you something. It'll make more sense later. In the next video, we'll talk more about this. But what I'm going to do is that this row function is going to take in an argument called props. Okay. As you'll see, props are things that come external. It's like basically information from the outside of the component. Okay. The simplest way to think about it right now is there's two sources of information or data that a component can have. Information from outside, that's going to be props, and information that comes from inside the component, that'll be called state. Okay, and we're going to do separate videos on all of those, and we're going to go over those in depth. But we're going to say, hey, this function is going to receive props, and then over here, I'm able to inject values into JSX. I'm able to actually like inject variables, whatnot. Another really cool thing. So in this case, from props, I can grab something called children. Okay, cool. We won't know what that is yet, but just believe me, basically it is going to be, you'll see in a second. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to app and I'm going to change what this has. So what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to start off with a row component. And inside that row component, so this time I wrote it like a normal HTML tag with an opening and closing tag. And inside that row component, I'm going to have 3 columns. Okay, and actually for that, since I don't plan on putting anything in the middle of the column, I'm just going to make them self-closing tags. So column like that. Okay, and I'm going to write 3 of these. Okay, just to show you how we can now use this to kind of start making nice sensical building blocks. So now I have a row with 3 columns. Okay, right now you don't see anything because they're just empty divs. Like when you see right now, they're just empty divs. And essentially, see here how it says props.children? The props.children, that's anything that's in between the opening and closing tag. So in this case, the children are these 3 columns. Okay, because they're inside the row component. They're inside the opening and closing tag. So the children are the 3 column components. So it's just saying, hey, we're basically here, just make those 3 column components show up here. That's essentially what that's saying. But let's actually make them visible using CSS. So what I'll do is I'll target the class of row. Row. Okay, and then we're going to say, hey, the row is going to have a border of 3 pixels solid red. Okay, the row is going to have a minimum height of 500 pixels. Okay. Width. Oh, wait, shit, did I give it a column or row? So row, yeah, so it has a class name of row. So we should be good there. So let me go back to the CSS. Row, oh, yeah, row, okay. Width should be, we'll say 100%. That's fine. Okay. Okay. And pixel solid red. And yeah. Now I'm going to refresh this page and I'm going to actually examine why am I not seeing my class name right now. So I don't see any errors. So let's see here. If I go in the main, I open that up. Again, the main is where we're injecting our root. So here I see that inside the main, because the main's acting as our main wrapper, I see there is a div class of row with 3 divs with a class of column. Okay, because that's essentially what when we translate all our components into HTML, that's the output. Okay, but let's see here, class of row, class of row. So this should have a border. Let me see why I may not. Maybe did I not connect the CSS file? That's probably what I forgot to do. So let me go back to my index.html here. And yeah, I think that's it. I forgot to connect the CSS file. So I'm going to head over here and connect that CSS file. Okay, and we're going to say ./style.css. And there we go. So there's our row. Okay. And then we'll style the column. .column. Okay, which is going to be, we'll say border 3 pixels solid blue. Okay, and we'll say minimum height 300 pixels. Okay, and see right now they're just breaking up because there's rows. So I'm going to make them, but I want to make them columns. So what I can do is then say the row is a flex box. So I'll say display flex. Okay, awesome. And then here I can say minimum width 300 pixels. Okay, and I need to forget the semicolon over here. Okay, cool. Okay, now you can see how those 3 columns are in there. Okay, so you can see how I can kind of construct, and like I have those 3 columns there, and then theoretically what I could do is I can go back to my components, pass props to columns, pass props.children over here, and now when I write these 3 columns, I could do them more like this. Okay, and then I'll just do 3 of these. And see, I can have as many columns as I want now. Okay, but now I can actually start putting stuff in there because I gave that props.children. So h1 high. So this becomes the props.children for that column. And then in this column, I'll do that for each column. So this one will be h1 2. And this one will be h1 3. Okay, and then when I hit save, okay, you can see here I have a row with 3 columns in it. So now notice the 2 things. One, it's much easier for me to read my markup because see, like this is pretty clear. I have a row with 3 columns in it. Okay, and I can see that effect there, and then I can put individual content in each of those columns. Okay, so using React, I can create building blocks that become a lot more sensical and a lot easier for me to think through to get the effect that I want. Okay, I combine that again with the CSS and some JavaScript, and other cool things you can do is, for example, I could at the end, here I'll just put the other component in for a second. Other component. Okay, I can create a variable in this function. So let's just say const cheese equals Gouda. And again, I can inject that in my JSX. Anytime I have a variable that's in scope, I could just put that in my JSX. Just use the curly brackets and say, hey, I want cheese here. And so you see Gouda right there. Okay, so React gives us this ability to build these building blocks. Okay, to essentially build what you see here, these building blocks, use these components inside of each other. But again, notice how everything starts with app. App becomes the parent of everything, And then, we define how those, then we build more building blocks that we use inside of app, and then we can build more building blocks that we use inside of those building blocks, and so forth until we have, we break down our website into the smallest pieces. And that is fundamentally like why React is cool. There's a lot more to it, but this should get you started. So my name is Alex Merced. Happy New Year's, and I'll see you in some more videos.